Greetings, friends of liberty. As beneficent as so many of the developments in my modern England are, with, for example, the Quakers having founded, along with 3 Anglicans, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, just 6 years ago in 1787, when the Quakers claim that 'tis their Christianity, their simple recognition of Christ's inner light they see in all men, that impels them to work to free the bondsman, and when they claim that Matthew 7:12, which says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," motivates their abolitionism, I can only think back with some irony to a very different but just as Christian English history in our own 12th and 13th centuries. What biblical verses did those very Christian English rulers and their spiritual mentors, the popes, quote then? Deuteronomy 23:19, "You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother." And Leviticus 25:36, "Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit." And so, since Christians were forbidden to take interest and only Jews allowed it, after a time, the Christian population understandably became angry, seeing the great wealth that the Jews had accumulated, with, for example, Aaron of Lincoln allegedly becoming the wealthiest man in all of England. But the citizens, not having the courage to become angry at the Popies, more their English rulers, or, God forbid, Holy Writ itself, instead blamed the Jews. How very brave of them, those Christians. And so we find, number 1, the killing of Jews by a mob after Richard III's coronation in 1189, and after his departure on the Third Crusade, Jews killed in Lynn, Bury St. Edmunds, and the death of approximately 150 in the wooden keep of the Castle of York in 1190. Number 2, the 1194 Ordinance of the Jewry, which recorded every loan a Jew made to enable a 10% charge. Number 3, the unsuccessful attempt by Pope Innocent III to forbid the Jews to receive interest, which, combined with their being outlawed to practice other trades, would have resulted in severe hardship, if not outright starvation. Number 4, the Jews now expelled from various towns, such as Newcastle, Southampton, and Newbury, and about 500 killed in the London massacre of 1265. Number 5, the Benedictines, spreading the fiction that Jews were murdering English babies. And 6, and finally, with Edward I in 1290, we see the expulsion of all Jews from England and a final expropriation of almost all their wealth. These were just some of the atrocities committed by English Christians, none of whom, oddly, saw the inner light, that spark of divinity, of their Jewish neighbors. Now, if we turn to the numerous instances of atrocities in the far less distant 20th century in France and Belgium during World War I by the very Christian armies of the Kaiser, we encounter today the remarkable history, German Atrocities, 1914, A History of Denial by John Horne and Alan Kramer. Horne, professor of modern European history at Trinity College, has also written, among others, Paramilitary Violence in Europe After the First World War. Kramer, his colleague, has written Dynamic of Destruction, Culture and Mass Killing in the First World War. Our authors begin here quite straightforwardly with a lengthy narrative description of the many atrocities committed by German troops from August to October of 1914. Almost as quickly as the guns of August began firing on August 4th, 1914, came reports from parts of Belgium and from Lorraine, 150 miles to the south, in France, of atrocities committed by portions of the 1 million-man German army. The Germans, for their part, claimed enemy civilians treacherously attacked German troops when they least expected it. The German troops immediately imagining and recalling the stories of the French resistance fighters called franc-tireurs of 44 years ago in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The German Army Schlieffen Plan for the war on the Western Front intended a massive and quick attack to overwhelm Belgium and French defenses and quickly drive to Paris. But in Liège, Belgium alone, the Germans were quickly frustrated and bogged down when 32,000 instead of 3,000 Belgian troops were found defending the city, with the result that it took 8 divisions to reduce Liège alone and cost the Germans valuable time as well as some 5,300 casualties because of their ill-advised direct frontal assaults. The German troops, frustrated and fearful, encountering legitimate resistance and counterattacks from retreating troops, from houses, and then from the other side of a river, interpreted that gunfire as coming from civilians. That night, German soldiers panicked in nearby Berrieux, shooting each other and killing 11 of their own men. Civilians were blamed, and 10 were shot down the next day, including a family with 5 children hiding in a cellar. This basic psychological template began multiplying itself. The first mass executions of civilians took place on the 5th of August. By the 8th of August, nearly 850 civilians had been killed and about 1,300 buildings deliberately burned down. Some of the German soldiers of the 34th Brigade had been so terrified that they fled straight into Holland, 10 to 15 miles away. Belgian nuns who tended the wounded that night in Blenny related the German soldiers' intense distrust of the inhabitants. There were some who showed a deep anxiety. They had been told that in Belgium, the wounded had their eyes gouged out, were poisoned, were finished off. At the village of Souman, the Germans placed the inhabitants under armed guard in the church. Male victims were selected and shot in a field in front of women and children. The execution squad bayoneted the bodies to ensure that no one survived. One injured victim, covered by corpses, lived to tell a story to the Belgian Commission of Inquiry. Civilians were used as human shields in the continued German assault on the fortress of Liège, as 170 later were in the town of Anloy and others. These, of course, were war crimes by the Hague Conventions of 1907. As the Germans retreated, their ambitious invasion schedule thrown into disarray, German soldiers vented their humiliation and rage on a series of villages, Aisne, Louvain, Pulseur, and Sprimont. In the village of Francorchamps, when a young tax inspector whose father had been shot for supposedly putting arsenic in water offered to German soldiers denied that he had fired on German soldiers from his window, he was told by an officer in French, "It doesn't matter, at Liège, you kill our men, we also have the right to kill you." Back in Germany, where hundreds of thousands of troops were stationed, the myth of Belgian resistance and atrocities soon spread back from Liège. The press in the Rhineland and throughout Germany from 8 or 9 August was full of tales of ferocious Belgian civilians preying on the invading Germans. An example being General Einem writing to his wife that the Belgian population had treacherously participated in nighttime attacks on his troops. Einem related that he had ordered villages where such incidents occurred to be burned and all the inhabitants shot. In another instance, the accidental breaking of a field telephone wire by a woman opening her shutters, and the tale that in the night of 12 to 15 August, the inhabitants of Arlon had signaled with lights, aroused General Esch to a fury. He razed the village. The Kaiser, too, Wilhelm II, as a Christian nationalist, had no problems believing such fantasies. He's saying, "The population of Belgium behaved in a diabolical, not to say bestial manner, not one iota better than the Cossacks. They tormented the wounded, beat them to death, killed doctors and medical orderlies, and fired secretly on men harmlessly standing in the street. One of the worst war crimes occurred when German troops deliberately set fire to the town of Louvain and its famous library, filled with priceless medieval manuscripts, they preventing civilians from putting out the fire, which eventually consumed the whole library. Overall, some 2,000 buildings were destroyed between 25 and 28 August. Few Louvain citizens remained in the town, most having been expelled to the surrounding district, where they were maltreated and marched around by the troops for days. Many were deported in cattle wagons to Germany. In some cases, such as the town of Choffen, where 157 civilians were lined up against a wall and shot, soldiers knew the victims as individuals were innocent, but they perceived the civilians as collectively culpable for the supposed actions of the Franc tireurs. However, only very rarely can one find any evidence of civilian resistance, as possibly by some citizens in the town of Neumanie around August 20th. As the reports of German atrocities spread throughout France and Belgium, the exodus of civilians, which had gradually built up ahead of the German invasion of Belgium, became such a flood that it hampered military operations. By early September, hundreds of thousands of Belgian and French refugees were falling back into the interior. Increasingly, German forces discovered half-empty towns and villages in which only the elderly and infirm or those who refused to abandon their property remained. If we now pause to summarize the minor and major incidents, we find that the total death toll of Belgian and French civilians deliberately killed by the German army during the invasion is 6,427, involving 129 major incidents during the invasion, 101 in Belgium and 28 in France. In addition, rapes occurred quite widely. Virtually every regiment in the initial assault force at Liège was involved in such brutality. Over 150 regiments out of some 500 are known to have participated in major incidents, and many more in minor ones. A figure of 15,000 to 20,000 buildings deliberately destroyed is a conservative estimate. Fire was the preferred method. Were there other equivalent acts occurring in other theaters during the war? A. The Russians invading the German frontier from the east into East Prussia in the beginning of the war committed few documented atrocities against the German population. However, against Austria, in invading Galicia, they willfully destroyed property and engaged in sporadic violence towards civilians, including rape. The Cossacks, especially, were responsible for brutal anti-Semitism. And when the Russians retreated from 1950 onwards, the Russian High Command emulated the scorched earth policy of 1812 and added to this the persecution of the civilian population, resulting in the deportation of at least 300,000 Lithuanians, 250,000 Latvians, 350,000 Jews, and 743,000 Poles. B. For the Austro-Hungarians, the two invasions of Serbia were accompanied by harsh action against villagers, including women and children. The Austrian army treating the Serbs just like the Germans treated the Belgians, although the death toll was perhaps only a quarter or less of the approximately 6,500 the Germans had killed. Let's now turn to describing how the Germans came to believe all these silly fables in the first place. Essentially, a false belief system, a collective delusion, arose, incorporating a number of elements and encouraged by the fact that there were no consequences to the Germans in getting it wrong. These elements were A. The fact that the French had used civilian volunteers and irregular fighters in the previous war. In total, in 1871, there were 300 Franc-tireur units with some 57,600 members. B. The fact that the Germans were nationalists and thus were more likely to believe ill of other nationalities. German nationalism was very widespread and its grandiose assumptions infected many areas of German life and society. One expression of it by a German officer was, "The Belgians rank with the Herero well below the level of the Hottentots." C, the fact that the Germans seemed to dislike the Republican, unofficial, insurrectionary aspect of guerrilla warfare, they believing instead in more formal army units. Numerous decorated German generals such as Moltke the Elder and Younger and others, such as von Kretschmann, detested French irregulars. Not surprisingly, the Germans officially rejected parts of the Hague Convention that had justified irregular warfare by smaller nations. D, the fact that these stories of alleged French treacherousness, priests organizing resistance, officials poisoning the water supply, citizens signaling from church towers, and young girls using scissors to mutilate and blind German soldiers circulated easily throughout the trenches, the army ranks, the press, and German civilian life being uncritically passed on in postcards, paintings, in published soldiers' diaries, and even in fiction. E, the fact that the French were Catholic and the recipients of a natural Protestant animosity. F, the fact that the German High Command at all levels initially never disputed or seriously debunked the fables, but to the contrary, encouraged them. G, as mentioned, the fact that the German war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was unlikely to work, given that the Germans needed more troops, and thus that the plan put pressure on the whole army with its impossible timetables, leading in numerous instances to German-friendly fire instances, and even to field kitchens not keeping up, leading the troops to requisition supplies from town and countryside. And once those troops got into the wine and cognac cellars, in their drunken stupor they started seeing franc-tireurs everywhere and shooting innocent civilians. H, in addition, the enemy refused to stand and fight as the Schlieffen Plan required, but rather inflicted painful losses before slipping away. Or, in another case, the devastating rifle fire of long-service professional British soldiers at Mons contributed to a rash of brutal German reprisals against civilians. Having given now some of the main presumptive reasons why the Germans believed this collective delusion, let's turn now to the Allied side and how they responded to the growing list of German war crimes. A, an article in Le Soir, already on 11 August, entitled "The Barbarians," expressed the emergent sense of outrage. By the 17th, the French newspaper Le Temps, having put two and two together while interviewing German POWs, realized that the Germans were indeed committing the brutalities they were because of their irrational fear of franc-tireurs. The British, not being as directly involved, but only learned some weeks later. But when they did, the magazine Punch published an article entitled "The Triumph of German Culture." The French followed that with postcards of an American Indian holding a spear and shield and saying to a German who was holding a rifle with bayonet, "You are even more savage than me." B, the columns of refugees fleeing the German atrocities grew. For example, by 20 August, over 20,000 refugees from Liège, Tirlemont, and Brussels crowded into Ghent, with their author speculating that, without the victory of the Marne, regional fear and broader anxiety might well have turned into a collapse of national morale. This happened in May-June 1940. Some 200,000 Belgian refugees fled to France, with slightly fewer reaching Britain, while 400,000 or more may have surged into Holland, mainly in the first 3 months of the war. C, as the Allies recovered territory from the Germans, the full scale of the horror became apparent, and various commissions were constituted to investigate the crimes. More than 1,200 depositions were taken in the autumn of 1914, mainly among the Belgian refugees in Britain, by a team operating under the authority of the Director of Public Prosecutions. This resulting in the Bryce Report, published in 1915, which concluded that the German army had used systematic terror as a military doctrine. The Germans, facing international censure, had no choice but to try to investigate and create reports of their own, in which they attempted to justify their behavior. the most famous of these being called the White Book. It achieved the conclusions the German government and army wanted by A, dropping half of all its witness statements, like that of Captain Hans Haut, who confessed to finishing off 2 women that a firing squad had unjustly shot. B, ignoring the vast evidence of panic and frustration among the German troops. C, ignoring that the Germans in their anxiety, confusion, and drunkenness frequently fired on their own men, then blaming fictional franc-tireurs. D, failing to mention that doctors had searched German hospitals for evidence of blinded and mutilated soldiers without success. And E, taking witness statements from men who were told what to say. This white paper, too, just as Punch had joked about German war crimes, was yet more evidence of German culture. French and German Catholics were split on the issue, with the Vatican refusing to condemn German atrocities in an attempt to be impartial. Many in Germany, especially socialists, pacifists, and those on the left, began harboring doubts about the official version of events. So, for example, in February 1915, Theodor Wolff, the liberal editor of the Berliner Tageblatt, challenged Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg in private to admit that the German army had committed atrocities. Bethmann replied, "Yes, it cannot be denied." And yet, it was, and continued to be. One way the German government tried to escape censure was by claiming that the Allies had A, committed their own atrocities, B, that the Allies had used colored troops, and C, that the British and French had allied themselves with the barbarian Russians. Now, given the brutality displayed by the Cossacks and the Russian army, there was some truth to this last charge for the Russians, but the French and British had very clean hands. The authors spend much of the remainder of the book showing more or less how, right after the war, the German government continued in its denial, it being entangled with the war guilt question of the Treaty of Versailles. How, moving into the interwar years, despite some exceptions, German society generally wouldn't accept that their army had committed atrocities. And finally, how in recent times, some Germans, such as one of the authors himself, have admitted and publicized the truth, but how others, such as those writing German encyclopedias, such as the famous Brockhaus 1996 edition, still often fail to mention these atrocities. In conclusion, for anyone interested in this subject, I would give this book an A+ for its superb coverage in 608 pages of virtually every aspect that's relevant. Hopeful that, as we progress as a species, and as the good guys become more and more prevalent, we can reduce the number of atrocities we commit. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.